I'd never thought much about my routines. The days bled into one another, each as unremarkable as the last. Morning started with coffee in my quiet kitchen, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Evenings were spent in the same chair by the window, with a book I'd read more for the comfort of its presence than its content. My life had settled into a rhythm so predictable it was almost invisible. The grocery store was part of that rhythm. Every Tuesday and Friday, I'd take my list, written neatly in my small cursive, and walk through the same aisles. There was a strange comfort in it, knowing exactly where everything was, the faces of the staff, even the faint smell of floor cleaner and fresh bread in the air. It was on one of those perfectly ordinary days, with my basket half full and my mind focused on whether to buy the apples or the pears, that I first saw him. He wasn't doing anything remarkable, just standing near the produce section, studying a bunch of bananas with a look of deep concentration that almost made me smile. He was young, at least half my age, maybe a little older, but there was something about him that caught my attention. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, relaxed but purposeful, as though he belonged wherever he stood. Or maybe it was his face, a quiet kindness in his eyes, a gentle curve to his mouth. Whatever it was, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A tiny flicker of curiosity. I didn't expect him to notice me. After all, I was just another middle-aged woman comparing apples and pears, hardly someone who stood out. But as I moved toward the apples, our eyes met. "Which do you think is better?" he asked, holding up the bananas. His voice was warm, with a hint of amusement, as though he found humor in his own question. "Depends," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Are you planning to eat them now or later?" "Later, I guess. Maybe for breakfast tomorrow. Then go for the ones with a little green on them. They'll last longer." He nodded thoughtfully, as though I'd offered sage advice, and put the bananas in his basket. Then, with a quick smile, he said, "Thanks. You've saved my breakfast." It was such a small interaction, so fleeting, that I almost laughed at myself for the way it stayed with me. As I walked through the rest of the store, I kept replaying it in my mind. There was something so unexpected about it, his openness, his ease. When I left the store that day, I noticed he was a few steps ahead of me in the parking lot, carrying his single bag of groceries. I watched as he got into an old car, the kind that spoke of practicality rather than pride, and drove away. I didn't even know his name, yet as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was as if, for a brief moment, someone had stepped into my quiet world and cracked the door open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. That night, as I sat by the window with my book, I found myself thinking about him again. About his smile, his voice, the simple, easy way he'd spoken to me. Was it silly to feel so affected by such a small thing? Probably. But for the first time in a long time, my world felt just a little less predictable. And that, I realized, was enough to make me smile the next time I saw him. It was almost as if the universe had arranged it. Same grocery store, same aisle. I was reaching for a box of tea when I heard his voice again, this time directed at me. "Are you an Earl Grey person or more of a green tea fan?" I turned, startled and delighted to see him standing there, holding a box of chamomile with a questioning look on his face. "Depends on the mood," I replied, recovering from my surprise. "Earl Grey for mornings, green tea for afternoons, and chamomile if you're planning to sleep." "Good to know," he said, grinning as he added the box to his basket. "I guess I'll take your advice again." There was an ease to our conversation, as though we'd known each other longer than a single exchange over bananas. He introduced himself, Liam, and asked for my name. I hesitated for a moment before answering. It had been so long since I'd met someone new, let alone someone who made me feel this seen. "Margot," I said, and his smile widened. "Nice to officially meet you, Margot." What started as a chance encounter quickly grew into something I hadn't expected. Over the following weeks, our paths seemed to cross more often. Sometimes in the store, sometimes at the small park nearby where I'd sit and read on sunny afternoons. Each time, we'd exchange pleasantries that turned into longer conversations. He was curious about everything. What books I liked, what I thought of the weather, even the best way to cook salmon. It was a kind of attention I wasn't used to, but it felt good, even if it left me slightly flustered. One afternoon, as we sat on a park bench together, I found myself laughing at one of his stories about a disastrous attempt to make homemade pizza. It ended with me eating toast, he said, shaking his head. I'm clearly not cut out for the culinary arts. Toast isn't so bad, I said, still smiling. It's better than setting the kitchen on fire. True, he agreed. Then, after a pause, he added, but maybe I just need a better teacher. His words lingered in the air, light-hearted but not without meaning. I glanced at him, wondering if he knew how much our growing friendship meant to me. For years, my life had been marked by solitude. Friends had drifted away, family was distant, and I had resigned myself to a quiet existence. But Liam's presence had shifted something in me. His energy, his curiosity, his genuine kindness, they brought a sense of joy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. As I walked home that evening, I caught myself smiling again. He had a way of making the world feel lighter, brighter, more full of possibility. And though I didn't fully understand why our connection felt so significant, I knew one thing for certain. I was grateful for it. But in the back of my mind, a question lingered. Was I imagining something more than what was there? Did he see me the same way I was starting to see him? Or was this just a fleeting moment of connection that I'd cherish quietly, never daring to hope for more? I shook my head, brushing the thoughts away. For now, it was enough to simply enjoy his company. Whatever this was, I would let it unfold in its own time. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the golden leaves swirled around my feet as I walked through the park. I had just settled onto a bench with a book when Liam appeared, his usual easy smile in place. Do you mind? He asked, gesturing to the empty space beside me. Not at all, I replied, closing my book as he sat down. He handed me a cup of coffee, the warmth of it seeping into my fingers. Thought you might need this, he said. It was a small gesture, but it felt impossibly thoughtful. Thank you, I said softly, glancing at him. For a while, we sat in companionable silence, watching a group of children play nearby. I could feel his presence next to me, solid and warm, and it struck me how natural it felt to be with him. You come here a lot, don't you? He asked after a while. I do, I admitted. It's peaceful here. Gives me time to think. What do you think about? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Everything, I said eventually. Life. Choices. What I've done and what I haven't done. He nodded, as though he understood. I think about that too sometimes, he said. About whether I'm doing enough, or if I'm wasting time. You're young, I said instinctively. You have all the time in the world. Maybe, he said, his tone thoughtful. But time doesn't feel like it waits for anyone, no matter how old you are. His words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I glanced at him, and for the first time, I saw not just the carefree young man I'd come to know, but someone with depth, someone who carried his own questions and uncertainties. It was then that I felt it, a sudden, undeniable tug in my chest. This was more than friendship, more than companionship. Somewhere along the way, my feelings had shifted, deepened, grown into something I hadn't anticipated. I looked away, my heart pounding as I grappled with the realization. How could this happen? I was old enough to be his mother. What on earth would he think if he knew? The rest of our conversation passed in a blur. I responded when necessary, laughed when appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. By the time he stood to leave, I felt as though I'd been turned inside out. Thanks for the coffee, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Anytime, he replied, his smile as warm as ever. See you soon, Margot. As I watched him walk away, my thoughts raced. What was I supposed to do with these feelings? Ignore them? Pretend they didn't exist? Or was it possible, no, foolish, to think they could be reciprocated? The questions swirled in my mind, each one heavier than the last. And yet, beneath the fear and doubt, a small, persistent ember of hope burned. Maybe, just maybe, life still had something unexpected in store for me. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite name. Each time I thought of Liam, his easy smile, the way he listened so intently, the spark of life he seemed to bring wherever he went, my heart fluttered and then sank. How ridiculous, I told myself. How utterly inappropriate. I was a woman in my 50s, with a life that had long since settled into its quiet rhythm. What place did these feelings have in my carefully constructed world? And yet I couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, studying the lines around my eyes, the gray streaks in my hair. I traced the faint crease at the corner of my mouth, evidence of years lived, moments laughed, tears shed. What could someone like Liam possibly see in me? Could he even see me at all beyond a friendly face he happened to encounter in the park or grocery store? The thought was as painful as it was sobering. But then I remembered the way he looked at me, his gaze steady and curious, as though he genuinely wanted to understand me. I recalled the warmth of his presence, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Still, the doubts lingered. What would people think? What would he think if he ever discovered the truth of my feelings? I didn't want to lose the connection we had, even if it meant suppressing these emotions that now consumed me. The next time we met, I tried to act as though nothing had changed. He joined me on the park bench, his usual grin lighting up his face. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone laced with concern. "Just lost in thought," I replied, hoping my smile seemed convincing. "What about?" he pressed, his head tilted in that way he did when he was genuinely interested. I hesitated, searching for a safe answer. "Life," I said eventually. "How it always finds ways to surprise you. That's a good thing, isn't it?" he asked, leaning back and looking up at the sky. "Most of the time, yes," I said softly. He glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "You're not alone in that, you know. Life surprises me all the time. Like meeting you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. Was I reading too much into them, or was there something more? I managed a small laugh, trying to deflect. "I doubt I'm that much of a surprise." "You'd be wrong," he said simply, his voice firm but kind. For a moment I didn't know what to say. The air between us felt charged, though with what I wasn't sure. Did he mean what I thought he did? Or was this just the product of my overactive imagination? When I returned home that evening, my mind was racing. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd spoken. Was it possible he felt the same pull I did? But even as hope flickered, so did fear. Would I dare to risk our fragile connection by revealing how I felt? Or would it be better to bury these emotions, to protect the delicate friendship we had built? The questions weighed heavily on my heart as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. No matter which path I chose, I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back from this moment. The idea had been forming in my mind for days, a persistent thought that refused to be dismissed. If I wanted answers, if I truly wanted to understand what was happening between Liam and me, I needed to take a step forward. Inviting him to my home felt like a natural progression, though the thought filled me with both excitement and apprehension. Would it seem too forward? Too strange? What would he think of me, a middle-aged woman asking a young man to come over for coffee or dinner? The doubts swirled, but I reminded myself of the simple truth. Liam made me feel alive, and I wasn't ready to let that feeling slip away without at least exploring what it meant. One afternoon, as we walked through the park together, I decided to seize the moment. "Liam," I began, my voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface, "would you like to come over sometime? For coffee, maybe?" He looked at me, his expression brightening in that effortless way of his. "Yeah, I'd like that," he said. "When were you thinking?" Relief and nervous anticipation coursed through me. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" "Perfect," he replied, his grin widening. "You make a mean coffee, right?" I laughed, grateful for his lightheartedness. "You'll have to judge for yourself." The next day, I busied myself preparing. I chose my favorite mug for him, set out the good biscuits I'd been saving, and even placed a small vase of fresh flowers on the table. It felt silly, almost juvenile, to fuss over such details, but I wanted everything to be just right. When the doorbell rang, my heart leapt. I took a deep breath, smoothed my sweater, and opened the door to find Liam standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said, his smile shy but genuine. "Oh, Liam," I murmured, touched beyond words. "Thank you. They're lovely." I led him inside, guiding him to the kitchen where the coffee was already brewing. As we sat at the table, the conversation flowed as easily as ever, but there was an undercurrent to it now, a warmth, a closeness that felt new. At one point he looked around, taking in the space. "Your home suits you," he said. "How so?" I asked, curious. "It's cozy," he replied. "Welcoming. Like you." His words left me momentarily speechless. I wasn't used to such open, unguarded compliments. We talked for hours, losing track of time as the daylight faded. At one point, I noticed how the soft lamplight played across his features, highlighting the quiet confidence in his expression. I wondered if he noticed how I was looking at him, or if he could hear the thundering of my heart as I sat across from him. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning to face me. "Thanks for today," he said, his voice warm. "I had a really great time." "So did I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like the world had gone still. Something unspoken passed between us, a question, a possibility. But then he smiled, the moment breaking like a wave retreating from the shore. "See you soon?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier now. "See you soon." As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it, my thoughts a whirlwind. The evening had been everything I'd hoped for, yet it left me with even more questions. Had I imagined the connection I felt? Or was it truly there, just waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged? It was a week later when Liam came back to my house, this time for a quiet dinner. He'd suggested Italian food, his favorite, he'd said, and I'd agreed, eager to see him again. This time, there was no pretense, no hesitancy in the air. Just the two of us, finally allowed to be in each other's presence without the weight of my doubts hanging between us. I had prepared pasta, fresh salad, and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. I wanted everything to be perfect. But it wasn't the meal that mattered, it was the moment. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift that had occurred when he walked through my door. As I placed the final dish on the table, Liam caught me by surprise. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes tracing my face with a tenderness that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice shaky. We sat down to eat, the conversation light and easy, just as it had always been. But the air between us was different this time. Charged, almost electric. Every glance, every smile felt laden with an emotion neither of us had quite dared to name before. Halfway through the meal, Liam set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice low. The words hung in the air, and I could feel the blood rush to my cheeks. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I know we've been friends for a while now," he continued, "but I think we both feel it, this connection, right?" I nodded, my pulse quickening as his words echoed in my ears. "I do," I admitted quietly. He leaned forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "I think about you all the time. More than I should. And I want to be honest with you, Margot. I don't know where this is going, but I know I don't want it to stop. Not yet." His confession took me by surprise. I hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. But there it was, laid bare between us. My heart hammered in my chest as I absorbed his words. I had spent so much time questioning everything. His feelings my own, the inevitable complications of age and expectations. And now, he was offering me something I hadn't dared to hope for, honesty. "I don't know where it's going either," I whispered. "But I can't deny what I feel." He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine gently, sending a wave of warmth through me. "You don't have to," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to decide right now. I just want you to know that I care about you. I've cared about you for a while now." The words, so simple yet so profound, broke something open inside me. The walls I had built around myself, the fears I had nurtured for so long, began to crumble. And then, without another word, he stood, walked over to my side of the table, and cupped my face in his hands. His lips met mine in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative like a question, and then deepened, soft and full of promise. It wasn't hurried or desperate, but slow and deliberate, as if we were both savoring the realization that this was what we had been moving toward all along. "When we finally pulled apart," breathless, he whispered, "I've wanted that for so long, Margot." I didn't know what to say. Words seemed unnecessary at that moment. Instead, I simply nodded, my heart full to the brim with everything that had been said and everything that had been left unsaid. The evening stretched on, but nothing was the same. We didn't need to speak of what had passed between us. It was already understood. That night, As I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I reflected on the unexpected turn my life had taken. The woman who had once feared the emptiness of her days now felt an overwhelming sense of fullness, a warmth that had nothing to do with the dinner we'd shared or the wine we'd sipped. It was the warmth of connection, of two people willing to embrace something beautiful and new, despite the uncertainties that loomed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid of the past or the future. I was only here in this moment with him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Liam's presence in my life, once a tentative whisper, was now an undeniable force. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about us. The connection we shared was something I had never anticipated, yet it was more real than anything I had ever known. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments when I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was a fleeting feeling, an infatuation that would fade with time. Or worse, if this was something he would eventually regret. Could he possibly understand the complexity of what we had? The weight of the years between us, the judgments that would inevitably follow if people found out. But then I would see him again, his smile, his eyes, his warmth, and I would remember why I was willing to take this leap. Liam didn't see me as a woman defined by her age. He saw me as I was, a woman with desires, with dreams, with a past that didn't diminish her worth. He made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't felt in years, and in those moments, the age gap between us felt insignificant. Still, there were times when the fear crept in. Society had its own rules, its own judgments. I was fully aware of the whispers that could follow, of the looks I might receive if anyone knew. Would they see me as foolish, desperate, or would they look at us and think that love, in whatever form it took, was something worth celebrating? But I didn't have the answers to those questions, not yet. One evening, as Liam and I sat together on the couch, our hands intertwined, I found myself lost in thought. His head rested on my shoulder, his breath steady and warm against my skin. I had never felt more at peace. "Do you ever wonder what people would think of us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam stirred slightly but didn't move away. "I don't really care about that," he said softly, squeezing my hand. "What matters is that I'm with you. What we have is real, and that's all I need to know." His words, simple yet profound, filled me with a calm that I hadn't expected. Maybe, just maybe, it didn't matter what anyone else thought. Maybe what mattered was that we had found something worth cherishing, despite the complications and challenges that might lie ahead. I had spent so many years trying to fit into the molds that society had created for me, molds that were too small for the woman I had become. I had tried to suppress desires, passions, and dreams that didn't align with what was appropriate for someone my age. But Liam had shattered that for me. With him, I was free to be exactly who I was, without apology, without shame. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to hide. This relationship had taught me so much about love, not the kind that follows rules or timelines, but the kind that is unrestrained, unconditional, and unapologetically real. Love, I realized, was not confined to a set of expectations. It didn't care about age, or past mistakes, or the paths we thought we were meant to follow. Love simply was. Liam had shown me that, in his quiet, steady way. He had brought me back to life, making me feel like a woman who was worthy of love, worthy of passion, no matter how many years had passed. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I questioned my own worth, when I feared what people might say. But those fears were fleeting, temporary. The love we shared was something deeper, something more enduring than the fleeting judgments of others. I had spent so many years thinking that the best part of life had already passed me by. But Liam had shown me that love could bloom at any age, that it could grow in unexpected places, and that it could bring joy, excitement, and renewal in ways I never thought possible. And as I held him close that evening, I realized that I was no longer afraid of what the future might hold. The love we shared was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. As the days passed, I found myself looking at the world with new eyes. The quiet, predictable life I had once known seemed like a distant memory, replaced by something far more vibrant and full of possibility. The once hollow spaces in my heart were now filled with the warmth of connection, the joy of a love I had never expected, and yet had always longed for. I had spent so many years thinking that love belonged only to the young, that the later years of life were a time for settling, for fading into a comfortable routine. But Liam had shown me that love wasn't bound by age, by time, or by what society deemed acceptable. Love was a force that could surge at any stage of life, unpredictable and untamable, and when it found you, it made you believe in the magic of it all over again. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if this was just a fleeting chapter, a beautiful but short-lived connection. But then I would look at Liam, his steady gaze, his laughter, the way he touched me as if I were the most important person in his world, and I would know that this was real. Our love was real. It had taught me so much, that we could love beyond what we thought were our limits, that age was nothing more than a number, that a heart could still beat with passion and desire even when the years had added lines and stories to it. In Liam, I had found not only love but also a new beginning. He had given me the courage to embrace the unknown, to open myself up to something beautiful and unexpected. I no longer cared about what others thought. The judgments, the whispers, they didn't matter. What mattered was that I had found someone who made me feel alive again, someone who saw me not as a woman defined by her past or her age, but as a person worthy of love. And in that, I had learned to love myself, too. Love had taught me that there is no age limit to happiness, to desire, or to the kind of deep, soulful connection that takes you by surprise and changes everything. I was living proof of that. So as I stood with Liam in my arms, looking out at the world with fresh eyes, I knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever the future held, we would face it together. There was no fear left in me, no hesitation. There was only love, and that I realized was the greatest gift of all.